So, Stephen, thank you very much for making the time to talk with us as we carry on this journey around ancient sites in India. And I wanted to, as you know, we're recording this for a conference which is very much about secular applications of mindfulness in a range of different settings. So maybe just to begin with, can I ask you to give us your comments on what you understand by the term mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness for me as a Buddhist monk or former Buddhist monk and a Buddhist teacher and writer has been part of my vocabulary for the last 40 years. And initially, mindfulness was, for me, an integral part of what Buddhism calls the Eightfold Path. So in other words, you have the way you look at the world, the way you motivate yourself, the way you speak, the way you act, the way you work, the way you apply your effort, and the way you pay attention and the way you concentrate. Mindfulness is the way you pay attention within that context of values, within that vision of the world, within that ethical framework. And mindfulness I've always understood as having a strong element of recollection. In other words, it's recollecting what it is that you value. It's remembering to be present. It's remembering to be focused. It's remembering to be back at the breath, remembering to notice what's happening in order that one can become more and more conscious and aware of the present moment, conscious and aware of what's arising within you, conscious and aware of what's going on in the world around you.
Thank you. And very interesting. Let me pick up on one thing. If I'm right, I don't think in the course of that response you mentioned meditation.
I didn't, but clearly the cultivation of mindfulness is something that one cultivates in the context of meditation. But I was first introduced to the idea as a Tibetan Buddhist monk in a work called the Bodhicharyavatara, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where it is presented more in the context of being mindful or remembering, recollecting what are your values.
Okay.
And it's not actually presented so much as a form of meditation, but as a kind of self-discipline. It becomes quite quickly a means whereby one works with the arising of particular mental states. And Shantideva, the author of this text, talks of how, he says, when anger arises, when fear arises, when jealousy arises, I should remain like a piece of wood. In other words, I should just notice what's going on without getting caught up in the emotion, without getting caught up in the story, and just to observe that these are passing states of mind, passing thoughts and emotions, and to realize that I'm free not to jump on board and get carried off by them. So that would be meditative, but in fact it's more a generalized attitude to how we live and operate in the world with a greater degree of self-awareness and consciousness.
I'd like to link the next question with something you said very early on, which was that your first encounter with mindfulness was as part of the Noble Eightfold Path, and to ask then the question as to what are your thoughts on the current uptake of mindfulness in health and education and organisational settings, which is often occurring separate from, not linked with, its Buddhist underpinnings in the Eightfold Path.
Well, I think one of the primary concerns of the Buddha and the Buddhist tradition is to address the question of human suffering. And if a Buddhist methodology like mindfulness meditation can be utilized in a context, in any context, that reduces human suffering, then clearly this is a good thing. And I think it would be churlish to say that, hey, you're taking it out of context, it should be applied to the Eightfold Path, would, I think, be a bit ridiculous. But clearly, once you do take it out of that context, you then have to ask whether it is still actually a Buddhist practice or not. and I don't see why it should be treated as such. I'm always rather amazed that the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, came up through his own inner reflections and experience with a form of meditative practice that had not been current in India at his time, and yet is now being shown to be efficacious within a totally different context than the one for which he would originally have intended it. But I'm very much in favour and very supportive of the application of mindfulness in any area of human endeavour where suffering is minimised, where people are made to be able to perform and to live more rich and flourishing lives.
Okay. To move on a little bit more into relevance of Buddhist teachings, you speak quite often about the four, what are commonly called the Four Noble Truths, although I know that's not how you perhaps prefer to label them. But what does your explication of the Four Noble Truths offer people who are coming to mindfulness from a more secular point of view, perhaps in terms of relevance and accessibility?
Well, the Four Noble Truths, as the very phrase suggests, is that these are truth propositions. And most elementary books on Buddhism will present these Four Noble Truths as something like existence is suffering, or existence contains suffering, that the origin of suffering is craving, that the cessation of suffering is the cessation of craving, and the Noble Eightfold Path is what leads to the cessation of craving and thereby the cessation of suffering, which is called nirvana. Now, recent scholarship has shown that the term Noble Truth is actually a later addition to the original text. And once you remove that notion, you remove the idea that these 4 points are, as it were, truth propositions that you either assent to or you don't. And so Buddhism immediately, therefore, becomes a belief system. A Buddhist is a person who believes that these 4 propositions are true, and someone who doesn't believe those propositions are true is not a Buddhist. Now, if you look at the very conclusion of the first discourse, the Buddha explicitly defines his enlightenment, his awakening, as having recognized, performed, and accomplished 4 tasks. And these tasks are to fully know suffering, to let go of craving, to experience moments at which that craving has stopped, is not operative any longer, and to create and to cultivate a way of life that he calls the Eightfold Path. Now, if you start to rethink the Four Noble Truths as these 4, we might say, ennobling tasks, you shift from a dogmatic presentation of this is the truth to a pragmatic application of these particular behaviours or responses to life itself. So the practice of mindfulness, therefore, fits very much into the practice of the first task, which is fully knowing dukkha. Dukkha, suffering, does not here just mean my own personal frustration or dissatisfaction or anxiety, but suffering refers to birth, sickness, aging, death. It refers, in fact, to the totality of your human condition in a specific situation that you find yourself in now. So as part of the practice of fully knowing dukkha, fully knowing life really, then you utilize the tool of paying close, sustained attention, of remembering, to be mindful, to be aware of whatever is happening. The notion of pariññā, fully knowing, implies to me a willingness to embrace the situation at hand, be that your own mental state, be that the suffering of another person that you encounter, and we might even now extend it to the suffering of the world as a whole, with issues such as injustice, environmental degradation, all of these things, according to the first noble task, are to be embraced. In other words, one is to say yes, to encounter what's happening, to notice the extent to which you tend to shy away or to avoid the situation if you find it difficult or somehow overwhelming or threatening, and to return and maintain an awareness of the situation in which you are more and more mindful and aware of what is happening. That is the starting point. And so in this sense, for a person who maybe have used mindfulness in a health-related issue, in a therapeutic sense, would perhaps now be able to expand that application from a specific, let's say, relapse into depression, into an attitude that may help you to respond and to operate more effectively and more fully in the context of your life as a whole.
Mm. Often, of course, and perhaps usually in clinical and many of the other applications of mindfulness that will be being talked about at this conference, people won't be introduced to the idea of the Four Noble Truths or necessarily directly to something which links closely with the notion of dukkha.
Mm.
To what extent and how often, and perhaps for what kind of people, but to what extent do you think it will commonly occur that people who practice mindfulness in a way that maybe has emphasized attention control, present in the current moment, awareness of your own internal states, to what extent do you think, as you see it, will that often lead people down a path which is similar to that you described of contemplation of the truth of suffering of dukkha?
Well, my wife and I spend much of each year, about 6 months, leading meditation retreats, and largely within the context of vipassana meditation. And wherever we go now, it's almost a given that a certain number of people who come on the retreat, particularly beginners, will have been introduced to this kind of meditation practice and to the Buddhist philosophy in which it's embedded through the use of mindfulness in some form of healthcare or something like that. And so I can't make any general guesses as to what percentage of people would follow this approach, but it is quite remarkable that in the last years this has become a very common way in which people end up taking an interest in Buddhist philosophy, or not necessarily becoming Buddhists in any way, but certainly trying to take what they've found to be of value in, let's say, for a health issue, and they seem to acknowledge that once you adopt this being in the present moment, being aware, not reacting, being greater control of your attention, that this is not, the purpose of this extends way beyond the particular problem you might have initially sought to deal with it. Certain people seem to click to the fact that this is a perspective from which one could, as it were, live one's life in a much more generalized sense. Now, nowadays, of course, it's very easy, even if you've been deliberately not informed that this is a Buddhist practice, you only have to Google the word mindfulness and you'll find out that it is a Buddhist meditation tradition. And a certain number of people are now finding their way into Buddhist practice, or at least into more in-depth meditation practice, through that introduction. Now, I find this very interesting because I think until recently, the interest in Buddhism usually was either because you had certain religious interests or because you've become disillusioned with Christianity and you were looking for another kind of substitute. Buddhism seemed attractive. Maybe philosophically you've come across Buddhist ideas, or you've been impressed by some Buddhist teacher like the Dalai Lama and felt inspired by him. But now people are coming into a Buddhist practice having already had a very personal experience of the effectiveness of that exercise. So they're coming, as it were, from something they know from within, some deep personal experience that is of value to them, and that is now taking them into a deeper practice of meditation or whatever it might be. That I think is a new thing, and I have no idea how that's going to pan out at all. But I do think it's a very curious and very new, novel way in which what has traditionally been thought of as a religion is now entering into an entirely secular context.
Mm. Many of the people that you've described, perhaps most of them, who would have come through clinical or personal development routes into meditation, would have been doing it probably primarily with a motivation for the self. Might well have been the self wants to avoid recurring depression, the self wants to avoid or treat or help recover from some kind of health problem or function better. How might you chart, or perhaps how have they charted, the relationship then between meditation and mindfulness as supported by that, and the way that that has effects on the self, and the routes towards the development of compassion, and how that might work and whether it might be important? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's very difficult to generalize here, and from my experience of leading retreats and helping and guiding people in the practice of mindfulness in that context over many years now, I'm not really aware that there is a kind of generalized progression from, let's say, being more aware of your own mind into being more compassionate for others. I don't find it at all difficult to think of a person for whom the practice of mindfulness remains, even after many years, exclusively a way of actually managing your own inner life, your mental life, your emotional life, and it may have no implications at all for how you then subsequently feel about other people. This, of course, may simply reflect a kind of temperamental stance, a certain sort of psychological typology, where the person is by nature perhaps introverted, self-regarding, and is primarily concerned with finding a way to sort of lead a more balanced and poised life in relation to the world. But I think a great number of people find that the more that one pays attention to one's own processes, and particularly when you start taking on board the Buddhist idea that in becoming aware, you pay attention to certain features of experience, impermanence, then this ever-present notion of dukkha, the tragic nature of experience, but then this other aspect where you start to notice that these processes are not me or mine. You start to realize that this experience you're having, although of course it's your experience rather than another person's experience, is in some senses simply being more present to the rising and the passing away of mental states that are very difficult really to identify as being intrinsically Stephen. They're simply thoughts, feelings, emotions, they come, they go. And in doing so, you disidentify with your experience as being somehow bounded within the concept of me. And I think a natural progression from that would be to start to realize that suffering is not just your problem, but suffering is something that occurs in the lives of those you know, in the lives of people you bump into in the street. My own sense is that through the paying attention to impermanence and dukkha and not self, you slowly become more sensitized to those features of experience wherever they occur. I suspect that for many people, and this is often reported on meditation retreats, you start in a way dropping some of your inhibitions, some of your guardedness. You become more open, you become more willing to be present to whatever is appearing to you, and I think that often leads to a certain sense of vulnerability that opens up. you become much more moved, perhaps, by the plight of another person, or by the suffering of an animal or a bird. And that movement, I do feel, arises out of the application of mindfulness, but within the context of this task of fully knowing the dukkha, the suffering condition of the world. And although that might lead to empathy, which is a term for which there's not an exact equivalent in Buddhism, that empathy does not necessarily going to lead to compassion. It could actually make you rather overwhelmed and rather spooked and maybe slightly terrified that you may have to deal with this. You could actually lead you to recoil from that suffering. But if you're practicing within a framework within which compassion and loving kindness are valorized, then I think it would be quite, in a sense, natural that you would seek to respond to the suffering of the other by wishing for that suffering not to occur, which is the classic definition of compassion, or wishing the person who's unhappy to be happy, which is the classic definition of metta, or loving kindness. But whether just by applying mindfulness you would naturally become more compassionate, I'm not so sure.
So mindfulness practice does not necessarily make you a better person?
Mindfulness in isolation from any kind of ethical context, I would say no. As we've seen, I mean, now it's being utilised in the Pentagon to help soldiers shoot people more efficiently. So, and that I don't think it might make them a better soldier, but is it making them a better human being? I would say the jury's out on that one. No, I don't think mindfulness is a kind of panacea for solving humanity's problems and making better people. I think it is only, part of a process that may, if you are committed to a certain conception of the good, that it would lead you that way. But again, I think we have to take into account an enormous variety of temperaments, of backgrounds, of religious values, of cultural values, all of which I don't think can be separated from the effectiveness, or otherwise, of a practice such as mindfulness.
I think one of the things that is of interest to quite a lot of the people at this conference, particularly who are working in the area of clinical applications, so with people who we may be working with who may really have quite substantial degrees of distress, of anxiety, of low mood, and sometimes of hopelessness and of despair, and even sometimes of states of confusion, perplexity, is the concern then, and you know, and in many respects, as you know, a lot of the interventions for more serious mental health problems have orientated towards relapse prevention rather than acute phase treatment. What do you think are the implications, really, given what you've said about the many different routes that people can follow, the many different paths that can unfold as people start taking on mindfulness practice, of potentially introducing mindfulness practice to people who actually are in mental states that may be quite, that may already be quite challenging for them?
Well, again, I have relatively little experience in this area, so I don't have a great deal to say. But I am aware of having worked with people in meditation retreats, some of whom do come with considerable degrees of what we might call psychological distress. It's also, of course, often the case when you start practicing meditation that this brings up memories of trauma, or just it unblocks certain repressions. It makes you often quite anxious, ill at ease, worried, maybe even slightly distressed, disturbed. And as a meditation teacher, one often finds oneself in the rather difficult position of saying, do I encourage this person to just persist with the meditation practice, Or would it be more appropriate to suggest the person seek some kind of therapeutic care, let's say through psychotherapy or psychiatry or whatever? That's a very difficult judgment call. But over the years, I've noticed how in certain cases the practice of mindfulness seems to lead people up to a kind of a brick wall. They just become hypersensitized, but not really able to cope or deal with what that sensitization is bringing up for them, in which case often I think one drops the meditation and goes into some more formal therapeutic practice. But at the same time, I've also dealt with meditators who have done lots and lots of therapy, who haven't managed to really get to the root of some of their deeper issues, and who have then actually committed themselves to very intense, long periods of meditation. In one case particularly, I have a friend who went off to Thailand and lived in a monastery for a couple of years in the forest, and actually resolved those issues, which were quite deep psychological issues, just through confronting them in the meditation process, working through them, and coming out with, I think, a really deep level of resolution and cure in that sense. So once again, I don't think there are, at least from my limited experience, simple, clear-cut answers to these kinds of questions.
One of the kinds of meditations, of course, that crops up a lot in Buddhist practice is meditation on death and impermanence. And this would be something that most clinicians, I think, would definitely shy away from encouraging clients or patients to do. But would you have a perception, can you see a way that might actually be beneficial to people who are facing life problems and perhaps psychological problems?
Well, again, I mean, in my own experience, it has been an enormously important meditation to do. And the reason for that, pretty much as I was taught it in the Tibetan Lam Rim approach, is that it forces you to clarify what your priorities are in life. If you cultivate this awareness that it's certain you're going to die, and that could happen at any time, then that provokes the question, okay, what really matters for me? So I've always seen death meditation as about trying to organize in your own life what it is that is of priority, of principal concern for you. And I think a lot of other problems are kind of resolved once you establish that clearer sense of priority. People often become preoccupied and obsessed with something that, in the light of death, is relatively trivial. It might be that they've got a certain anxiety about how people think about them, or I can think of a million other examples that can become very, in a sense, disabling in their lives. But once you see that within the bigger picture of, well, here I am on Earth, in this extraordinary, weird, wonderful world, and I'm only going to be here for another 20, 30, 40 years max, and I might even be gone next week, it kind of puts things into perspective. Now, of course, Buddhism has its own sense of the bigger perspective of multiple lifetimes and so on, but I think just in living here and now in this life, to see it from the perspective of death, I think can often allow a lot of pettiness to fall away, and for one to somehow take one's life more seriously. I think often what meditation allows is a kind of a seriousness, a fascination in the sense of that sort of Socratic idea of leading an examined life. And meditation often leads you to examine your life, to take a deeper interest in what's going on, and very often in shedding some of one's culturally conditioned ambitions and concerns, you start to somehow become just deeply curious and passionate about what it means to live fully, to live in a whole, integrated way. And mindfulness, I think, is an extraordinarily useful tool to help us do that. But I think if you don't have the prior interest, to take those sorts of questions seriously, then the mindfulness will have a relatively lesser role perhaps in your overall concern as to what it means to live a human life.
Thank you. Let me tiptoe into another area of sort of traditional Buddhist thought, and ask you to talk a bit about the idea of karma. Because while I know from your teachings and your writings that there's a lot of the traditional ideas around karma that you don't share, do you think anything remains of that concept in a secular Buddhism as you're constructing it in some measure, that may be of use to Western secular Buddhists, including to people seeking to apply related principles in clinical or other contexts?
Well, there's an enormous amount of mysticism and confusion around the use of the word karma, and I think that was probably around at the Buddha's time as well. The Buddha in the early text, and again even in the Tibetan tradition, they're quite aware of this, that karma means action, and action in the classical definition is intention. Now, there are one or two passages in the early text where the Buddha clearly states that the actions we commit, the intentions that give rise to acts, generate effects. And these effects are things that are observable in your own life. And I think if we apply the practice of mindfulness to this idea of how intentions lead to us saying things and doing things which have consequences in the world, and also very often consequences for us. We might feel guilty, or we might feel very full of pride in something we did. Mindfulness is again a frame or let's say a perspective in which we become more acutely attentive of what it is that gives rise to thoughts and feelings that prompt us to act. And action is karma, and karma has consequences. And those consequences, I think, can be paid attention to, understood within this framework of noticing how it is that you come to do something, and what the consequences on yourself and other are of those actions that you commit. So I just see it as really part of the field of mindful attention. Mindfulness is particularly important, I think, in becoming more aware of the initial kind of bubbling up of a reaction, let's say, or a feeling of resentment, or a very kind of deep-seated attraction or longing for something. And very often, if we don't practice mindfulness, we find ourselves caught up in processes of thinking that are basically on the very edge of breaking into speech and acts, often at such a level of compulsion that we can't resist. And we find ourselves doing things, we find ourselves saying things that we subsequently deeply regret. Now, mindfulness comes into play here in becoming more attentive and more conscious of the very first stirrings of what it is within us that prompts us to act. And so if we can, as it were, nip those things in the bud, or if we can see them arising rather than find ourselves taken over by them, that I think would be a very valuable application of mindfulness in our moral life. We'll become more aware of how we behave, of how we get ourselves caught up in particularly those forms of action that cause harm to ourselves, to others, and will perhaps enable us to desist before the impulse to act becomes overwhelming.
As you're talking, what I find myself reflecting on is that those observations, I think, have relevance for everybody, but I think they have a particular set of applications for people who are working in human caring professions, including clinicians, where in many respects there is a very strong expectation that your response in a professional or a clinical setting will be a considered, measured one, which notionally at least should be divorced from your own personal responses and values. And there is some evidence emerging that mindfulness training can support clinicians, for instance, in becoming more empathic. From my own side, I recall getting challenged when I started working in counselling spheres and in psychiatry with this idea that you were supposed to both be an accurate observer of mental states and also to demonstrate unconditional positive regard. And I found myself working out, where are you supposed to get that from? So I wonder about your thoughts about possible applications and the relevance of mindfulness practice and perhaps other Buddhist practices for people trying to work in the world in terms of helping people, including helping people who may be in quite difficult circumstances.
Well, I mean, if I think of this in terms of my own reading of the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Tasks, then it mirrors very much what you've just described in terms of your own training there. The starting point of these four tasks is to fully embrace the condition that you find yourself at a given moment. The next step is to let go of craving, is the jargon term. But what that basically means is to notice how your encounter with life triggers certain habitual reactive patterns. They may, I mean, the classical ones are greed and hatred, but nonetheless, life tends to trigger a reaction, and that reaction is often instinctual, it's often something that's driven by your conditioning, and the second task is to let go of that reactivity. Now that doesn't mean that you magically find a way of switching it off, because obviously it's just a natural process that's arriving, but by being mindful and attentive of it, and this is where the practice of mindfulness would enter into the second noble truth, letting go of craving, is pretty much what I've just said, is that you notice more and more at its inception the arising or the triggering of habitual reactivity, or it could be, let's say, self-centered fantasies. If we take, for example, a person comes for a meditation interview, first I need to fully embrace the situation that person's in as unconditionally as possible. So your unconditional positive regard is basically another way of saying fully embrace dukkha. And the next step, which can happen simultaneously, is I notice my own fantasy of wanting to impress the person, let's say, want to say something wise. I'm a Buddhist teacher, therefore I have to behave in this way or other way. I can't let them notice that I've got this, whatever it is. I notice all that. I don't try to sort of stamp it down. I notice it, I recognize it, but in doing so, I'm somehow also just freeing it to play its own little game without me buying into it. And that leads to moments, or let's say to the possibility, in which I can stay with that person coming to see me about meditation, in an inner stillness where that kind of reactivity is not operative. And that is again another way of describing the meditative state, or the mindful state, or the aware state. And so it's from that stillness, fully aware of what's coming up in my mind, as open as possible to the suffering the person might be bringing into the room, that I can then respond or act regarding that situation in a way that is not determined by that habitual reactivity. And that would be a way of life, a response that the Buddha would regard as right speech, right action, or another element of the Eightfold Path. So thinking of these four truths as four tasks frames it within a practice that can be applied, I would say, pretty much to any kind of human interaction, whether it be in a healthcare, whether it be in teaching meditation, whether it be in making a difficult decision in a business meeting. It would seem to me that we're describing a very similar process that is, of course, in a sense, relatively simple to understand, but definitely not easy to apply in practice. That's the challenge. Can I do that? And also to learn from the times when I fail to do that, when I get caught up in my own egoism or in my own fears or in my own hesitations, rather than speaking from the heart, responding from that state of clarity and stillness.
The introduction of mindfulness into so many techniques, clinical and others these days, is also presenting a lot of professionals with the challenge of becoming mindfulness teachers. And for many people that is adding, in a sense, to their repertoire to their skills repertoire, but it also represents setting out on a journey which may be qualitatively rather different from what's led to them acquiring their previous skills. Do you have any general advice or comments for those of us, for people in that situation who may have professional backgrounds but not necessarily have backgrounds in mindfulness, who nonetheless want to actually set out down the route of using these kinds of techniques in their work?
Well, again, I've noticed over the years in teaching meditation that some people sort of get the idea of mindfulness quite quickly and easily, and others, who often go on lots of retreats and so on, seem to struggle to actually kind of get what it is doing, what it's actually about. And clearly a person who has a natural affinity to this kind of way of being would, to my mind, be a person who would be, in a sense, better suited to pursuing a life in which you would use mindfulness in treating others. I do think it's a practice that if you haven't really integrated it into your own life, I think it would be quite difficult to be able to apply it effectively in helping others. And broadly speaking, it seems to me the case that for such a person they should consider doing as much sustained meditation retreat as possible, because it's in that environment, probably more than any other, where you really develop a taste or a feel, almost on a somatic level, for the actual experience of what it is to be in this world from a perspective of a more mindful, aware and caring frame of mind. And in a meditation retreat, when you are in a silent environment, which you have a regular, structured program of sittings and walking exercises through the day, in which also you get talks, discussions which allow you to reflect on what's going on, but primarily in order that you can really get a deep first-hand experiential sense of what mindfulness is about. That to me would seem fairly indispensable if a person wishes to pursue mindfulness in a way to really be of value to others. But I would balance the two: a natural affinity on the one hand, and a committed and regular practice in retreat settings to really get, as it were, the felt sense of what this means to be mindful.
Thank you. As you're charting the course, as I think you're doing in a way that is very important, of the form that secular Buddhism can take as the 21st century unfolds, you're doing that in the context of a society that has a very important cultural affinity with science, with empirical investigation, and this conference is Mindfulness, Science and Practice, and we're going to be talking a lot about empirical investigations into the kinds of changes that may be associated with mindfulness practice. I'm wondering, as you're looking forward and as you see a secular Buddhism perhaps developing and unfolding, what you might see as a possible reciprocal relationship between scientific and perhaps psychological or other scientific, empirical, investigative sciences and a secular Buddhism. What are the ways in which if any, that you feel that there might be questions that might be arising for a secular Buddhism that might have in some of their aspects empirical answers to which psychological or other social sciences might be able to make a contribution?
Well, again, I think this is an enormously important question, but one I don't feel entirely qualified to answer in any depth. Clearly, as Buddhism comes into a more close encounter with modern secular Western society, it will engage in dialogues, in discussions, and in exchanges of ideas with practitioners of the natural sciences who, of course, value empirical testing and so forth and so on. And this has always been the case in the history of Buddhism, is that it has, each time it's found itself in a new cultural, historical environment, it has had to somehow speak to the needs of people at that time. It's had to, in a way, adapt itself to fit what that culture would regard as effective or valuable or whatever, and that has given rise to the diverse schools of Buddhism we find today. So Tibetan Buddhism is, in a sense, the result of a dialogue between Indian Buddhism and Tibetan culture, ditto China, Japan, and elsewhere. So a similar process is going to occur and is already occurring. I mean, the very fact of our discussion here about mindfulness in healthcare is already a very striking example of how Buddhism and the modern world have interacted, and this mindfulness, MBSR for example, is a product of that encounter. If Buddhism hadn't come into the West, it probably wouldn't have happened, as far as we can tell. And of course this is a two-way process. Just as modern medical practitioners may draw upon the expertise of Buddhism, I also think that Buddhism has to allow itself to be challenged by the insights we have into, say, the nature of the human body, the nature of consciousness, the nature of the brain, and I feel that Buddhists can't just pretend that that hasn't happened. There does, I think, need to be a recognition that a lot of the practices we do can be, as it were, validated, or let's say confirmed or otherwise, through empirical observation, rather than saying, well, this is the teaching of the Buddha, it's coming from the enlightened mind, therefore it's bound to be effective in what it does. I don't think we can really think like that anymore. I think we have to judge the effectiveness of Buddhist practice in terms of in a sense, real-world results. But at the same time, we must be careful, I think, not to reduce Buddhism simply to some kind of spiritual technology. That I think that Buddhism is also, and perhaps more importantly, a culture with a framework of ethical and philosophical, maybe even spiritual and religious values that seeks to inform the whole of human life as to what might support a human life's flourishing in the world. And I would be slightly uncomfortable with the idea that that sort of human flourishing could somehow be measured according to some set of criteria coming out of a sort of cold clinical analysis of its results. So I would like to think of Buddhism as not just working on the coalface of human suffering, but also inspiring people to work in the arts, for example. I think Buddhism can also be seen in our culture as being very informative of the work of poets and musicians and artists. Now here we're into a sphere of human life that I don't think can be subject to those same sorts of empirical evidence-based judgments as to its relative value or not. So provided that we don't lose sight of the fact that Buddhism is something that goes beyond results that can be reductively measured in some way, but at the same time to acknowledge that elements of Buddhist practice are, I think, amenable to that kind of judgment, then I think we will probably be okay. But again, I think this is we're at such a beginning of this encounter that it's premature right now, I think, to, in a sense, argue one way or the other. I think we have to more or less just see how this unfolds and what happens, and allow ourselves to be open to being surprised. And I mean Buddhists and Western people too. We don't know what the consequences of this encounter are going to produce. I mean, 40 years ago, no one that I knew would have predicted that mindfulness would be freely available on the British National Health Service. It's so almost hallucinatory that one has to, I think, have the humility to recognise that we might be engaged in an intercultural process, the consequences of which are simply not things that we're in a position to pre-guess at all. Stephen,
thank you.
Thank you, Graham.
The sun is now setting.
Setting.
here in Navla in the highlands of central India. So we'll draw this discussion to a close, hoping that, assuming the technology works fine when we show this in March, we should then be able to follow it on, all being well, with a bit of discussion with you to follow up on the points.
That would be great.
But I think I'd like to thank you personally from my side, and on behalf of the conference, for making the time to do this. And certainly from my side, it's been a rich experience having this discussion with you, and I'm sure that it will be making a very important contribution to the program and the process of the conference that will be happening in March. So, Stephen, greatest thanks.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you everybody for listening.